My wife's rich boss slipped his hand into my wife's pants at the company's party and said, "Leave. She's mine now, or face me man to man." 10 minutes later, he couldn't walk, stand, or talk. I broke his bones. Revenge for justified or not. You know how they say life comes at you fast? Well, whoever they are clearly never attended a corporate party where the highlight was supposed to be mediocre canapes and watching your coworkers pretend they actually like each other. I should have known something was off when Ava spent 45 minutes getting ready for what was essentially a glorified office mixer with worse lighting and cheaper wine. "Honey, do I look okay?" she asked, doing that thing where she smooths her dress down for the 15th time. And let me tell you something about my wife. Ava could roll out of bed looking like she stepped off a magazine cover, but she's got this habit of doubting herself that makes me want to punch mirrors. She looked absolutely stunning, of course. Black dress that hugged her curves in all the right places. Hair swept up in that effortless way that probably took an hour to perfect. And that smile she reserves for occasions when she's trying to convince the world, and maybe herself, that everything's peachy keen. "You look incredible," I told her, and I meant every damn word. "Now can we please get this over with so we can come home and order pizza like civilized people?" She laughed, that genuine sound that makes my chest do weird things even after 8 years of marriage. "Come on, it'll be fun. Open bar, remember? Fun, right? Because nothing screams good time like watching Dave from accounting do his annual impression of a functioning alcoholic while the HR department pretends they don't see him grinding on the copy machine. But hey, free booze is free booze, and I figured if I had to endure 3 hours of forced small talk and corporate team-building nonsense, I might as well do it with a decent buzz. I wrestled myself into the one suit that still fits me, and by fits, I mean the pants don't require a crowbar to zip up and the jacket only makes me look slightly like a stuffed sausage. Thank God for dry cleaners and their mysterious ability to make clothes pretend you haven't gained 15 pounds since your wedding. I practiced my supportive husband smile in the bathroom mirror, you know, the one that says, "I'm totally here for my wife's career advancement," instead of, "I'd rather be home watching Netflix in my underwear." The venue was one of those generic hotel ballrooms that looked like they were decorated by someone whose only qualification was, "I once stayed at a Holiday Inn." Beige walls, beige carpet, beige everything, with the kind of lighting that makes everyone look either dead or jaundiced. The DJ, and I use that term loosely, had apparently gotten his playlist from a 1998 wedding reception and was currently subjecting us all to Hotel California, like it was some kind of personality statement. Because nothing says, "I understand modern entertainment," like playing the same song your dad probably slow danced to at his senior prom. "Well," I said to Ava as we walked in, "at least the shrimp platter looks like it won't give us food poisoning." She elbowed me in the ribs, but she was trying not to smile, so I counted it as a win. We made the rounds, doing that awkward dance of corporate socializing where everyone asks how you're doing, but doesn't actually want an honest answer. "Oh, you know, living the dream," I told Melissa from marketing, while internally calculating how many drinks it would take to make her story about her cat's surgery tolerable. Ava, meanwhile, was working the room like the professional she is, making genuine connections while I stood there like her slightly uncomfortable sidekick, nodding at appropriate intervals and trying not to check my watch every 30 seconds. We were maybe 10 minutes into what I optimistically estimated would be 2 hours and 50 minutes of mildly embarrassing small talk when the energy in the room shifted. You know that moment when a record scratches in a movie? It was like that, except the record was the general hum of conversation, and it got replaced by something that felt a lot like collective held breath. That's when Roman Blackwell made his entrance. Now, I'd heard of Roman Blackwell the way you hear about natural disasters or tax audits, as something terrible that happens to other people. The guy was local royalty, the kind of rich that comes with its own zip code and the assumption that normal rules don't apply. He owned half the commercial real estate downtown, had his name on at least 3 buildings, and apparently thought money was a valid substitute for having an actual personality. He didn't walk into that ballroom. He swaggered, like he'd personally funded the construction of the building, and everyone in it owed him a thank you note. The man had that expensive smile thing down to an art form, the kind of grin that screams, "I can buy and sell you without checking my bank balance." His suit probably cost more than my car, and he wore it like armor designed specifically to remind everyone else of their place in the food chain. But here's the thing that really got under my skin. He didn't even glance in my direction. Not once. His eyes went straight to Ava like she was the newest Tesla model in a showroom full of beat-up Honda Civics. The way he looked at her, like she was some kind of acquisition opportunity, made something cold and angry start churning in my gut. If looks were tax deductions, this guy would have been writing off his entire personality as a business expense. He stood there surveying the room like he was deciding which piece of furniture to buy, and when his gaze landed on my wife, it stayed there with the kind of predatory focus that makes decent people want to take very long, very hot showers. I felt Ava tense beside me, that subtle shift that happens when a woman realizes she's being hunted. Her smile didn't falter. She's too professional for that. But I could see it in the way her shoulders straightened, the way her hand found mine and squeezed just a little too tight. "Who is that?" she whispered, though I could tell she already knew. Everyone in the room knew. Roman Blackwell didn't need introductions. He carried his reputation like a business card stapled to his forehead. "Trouble," I said, and boy, was that the understatement of the century. If I'd known what was coming next, I would have grabbed Ava's hand and walked straight out of that beige nightmare. Would have saved us both a lot of grief and me a lot of explaining to do later. But hindsight's 2020, and foresight apparently requires a crystal ball I didn't own. So we stood there, drinks in hand, watching Roman Blackwell work the room like he owned it, completely unaware that our quiet, ordinary life was about to get turned inside out by a man who thought the world was his personal shopping mall. The DJ chose that exact moment to switch to My Way by Frank Sinatra, because apparently the universe has a sense of irony that would make Shakespeare weep. You ever have one of those moments where time does that weird slow motion thing? Like you're watching a car accident happen in real time, but your brain hasn't quite caught up to the fact that you're about to be roadkill? Yeah, well, welcome to my Tuesday night, population. Me, about to learn that some people really do think the world operates like their personal adult playground. Roman Blackwell didn't believe in subtlety the way most people don't believe in unicorns. It just wasn't part of his reality. The man approached social situations like a hostile corporate takeover, all swagger and zero regard for what normal human beings call boundaries. He cut through the crowd with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no by anyone who mattered. His expensive shoes clicking against the ballroom floor like a countdown timer nobody asked for. I watched him zero in on us with the focus of a heat-seeking missile programmed to ruin perfectly decent evenings. Ava's grip on my arm tightened, and I could feel that subtle shift that happens when prey realizes the predator has locked on. But here's the thing about my wife. She's got more class in her pinky finger than most people manage in their entire bodies. So even when she's uncomfortable, she maintains that professional smile that got her through 8 years of climbing the corporate ladder. "Mrs. Peterson," Roman said, sliding up to us smooth as a yacht commercial, completely ignoring me like I was part of the furniture. "I've heard so much about your work on the Henderson project. Impressive stuff." Now, I'll give credit where it's due. The man had done his homework. Ava had spent 6 months pulling that project out of development hell, working nights and weekends to salvage what should have been a career-ending disaster. The fact that he knew about it meant he'd been paying attention, which somehow made everything infinitely creepier. "Thank you," Ava replied, and I could hear that careful tone she uses when she's trying to be polite to someone who makes her skin crawl. It was definitely a team effort. "Modest," Roman chuckled, like modesty was some quaint character flaw he found amusing. "I respect that. In fact, I've been thinking we should discuss some opportunities. My company could use someone with your talents." The way he said talents made me want to take a shower with steel wool, but I stood there playing the role of supportive husband, sipping my martini and trying not to let my face broadcast what I was thinking, which was basically a detailed mental catalog of all the ways this conversation could go sideways. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have grabbed Ava and made some excuse about needing to check on our imaginary babysitter. I should have done a lot of things that didn't involve standing there like a mannequin while Roman Blackwell prepared to turn our lives into a cautionary tale about why some people shouldn't be allowed out in public. What he did next happened so fast that my brain spent a good 3 seconds trying to process it, like a computer running Windows 95 trying to load a modern web page. One moment, Roman was standing there doing his whole charming businessman routine, and the next moment, his hand was, well, let's just say it was exploring territory that definitely wasn't listed on any tourist maps. He slipped his hand under Ava's dress, smooth as silk and twice as slimy, like he had some kind of backstage pass to her personal space. His fingers found their way into her pants like he was checking for loose change, casual as ordering room service, while his mouth kept moving with that same entitled smile. "Leave," he said to me, not even bothering to look in my direction, his voice carrying all the authority of someone who'd never been punched in the face by a man whose wife he'd just groped. "She's mine now, or face me man to man." And there it was, folks, the line that turned my quiet Tuesday evening into the kind of story that gets told at bar fights and family reunions for the next 20 years. Not, "Excuse me," or "Pardon me," or even, "Hey, mind if I completely violate your wife's personal autonomy?" Nope, just a casual announcement of ownership, like Ava was a piece of real estate he'd decided to acquire. The room went dead quiet for about half a second, that special kind of silence that happens right before all hell breaks loose. Then it got awkwardly, frantically louder, because apparently nothing brings out humanity's finest instincts like the opportunity to record someone else's complete moral breakdown for social media posterity. Phones started popping up like mushrooms after rain. Because of course they did. Why experience a moment of genuine human crisis when you can livestream it for your followers? I could practically hear the notifications pinging. "OMG, you guys, some rich dude just totally assaulted this woman at a corporate party. Hashtag drama, hashtag blessed, hashtag corporate life." Ava, God bless her, didn't freeze. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse into some Victorian-era fainting spell. Instead, she shoved his hand away from her like she was swatting a particularly disgusting fly, her face a mask of professional composure wrapped around what I could only imagine was pure, concentrated fury. "Get your hands off me," she said, her voice steady as bedrock and about twice as hard. No wobble, no tears, just the kind of steel-wrapped in silk tone that probably made Roman's ancestors roll over in their gold-plated graves. Me? I just stood there staring at my martini like it held the secrets of the universe, watching the olive bob around while my brain tried to catch up with the fact that my life had just transformed from quiet suburban comedy to old-school action movie faster than you could say sexual assault charge. The crowd was doing that thing people do when they witness something simultaneously horrifying and oddly entertaining. Half of them were hoping for more drama. The other half were probably hoping the appetizer table would get restocked soon. Because nothing says modern American values like treating someone else's trauma as dinner theater. Roman stood there looking genuinely confused, like Ava's rejection was some kind of software glitch he couldn't quite process. His entitled little brain was apparently running the same program it always ran. "I want something, therefore I should have it." Except this time the something was fighting back. I looked at my wife, standing there with her chin up and fire in her eyes. And then I looked at Roman Blackwell, sexual predator and part-time human garbage disposal, and realized that this was one of those moments that define the rest of your life. Either I was going to stand here and let this overgrown frat boy treat my wife like his personal property, or I was about to give everyone in this beige nightmare something to really post about. You know what's funny about rich guys who think they're tough? They always want an audience for their little performances, like masculinity is some kind of Broadway show that requires applause and ticket sales. Roman Blackwell was no exception to this rule. In fact, he was probably the poster child for how to be a walking stereotype while wearing a suit that costs more than most people's cars. The man stepped back from Ava, not because he suddenly developed a conscience or anything radical like that, but because he wanted room to perform. You could practically see the gears turning in his entitled little brain. Time to show these peasants how alpha males handle business. His chest puffed out like a peacock having an identity crisis, and he rolled his shoulders back in that way guys do when they've watched too many action movies and think real life comes with stunt coordinators. "You heard me," he said, pointing at me like I was some kind of furniture that had offended him by existing in his general vicinity. "Face me man to man. Unless you're too much of a coward to defend what's yours." What's yours? Like Ava was a possession instead of a human being with her own thoughts, feelings, and perfectly functional right hook that Roman was about to learn all about if he kept running his mouth. but I'm getting ahead of myself. The crowd around us had transformed into something out of a nature documentary. You know, the kind where they film predators circling wounded prey while David Attenborough narrates in that soothing British accent. Except instead of lions and gazelles, we had middle management and sales executives, and instead of David Attenborough, we had Karen from HR frantically whispering into her phone, probably calling her supervisor to ask if there was a corporate policy for what to do when a millionaire sexually assaults someone at the company party. Roman's assistant, Jasper, and yes, that was actually his name, because apparently when you're rich enough, you get to hire people whose names sound like they belong in a Victorian novel. Did that little laugh snort thing that people practice when they've memorized their personality from a men's lifestyle podcast. You know the sound. Part hyena, part dying whale, all cringe. Boss doesn't usually have to ask twice. Jasper chimed in, like he was providing color commentary for the world's most pathetic sporting event. The guy looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts at a Douchebags R Us warehouse sale. Perfectly styled hair that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Cologne that could be detected from low Earth orbit, and the kind of smirk that made you want to explain basic human decency using small words and visual aids. Phone cameras were popping up faster than weeds after rain, because nothing says modern American values like turning someone else's trauma into content for your Instagram story. I could practically hear the notifications pinging already. OMG, you guys, there's about to be a fight at this corporate party. Link in bio. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The crowd had that weird energy you get at car accidents and middle school cafeteria fights. Part horror, part fascination, and about 90%, thank God it's not me. People were trying to look casual while obviously angling for the best camera shots, like they were paparazzi at a red carpet event, instead of office workers witnessing what was about to become either a lawsuit or a police report. Possibly both. Please don't. Ava whispered, her hand gripping my arm with the kind of strength that comes from pure adrenaline and justified terror. She knew me well enough to recognize the look on my face. The same expression I got when someone cut us off in traffic or when the cable company tried to charge us for premium channels we'd never ordered. Except this time, instead of road rage or customer service fury, it was something much colder and infinitely more focused. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman who'd spent 6 months working nights and weekends to save a project that wasn't even her responsibility. The woman who brought coffee to our elderly neighbor every Sunday morning. The woman who cried during dog food commercials, but maintained perfect composure during board meetings with men who thought her gender was a character flaw. The woman who deserved to go to corporate parties without some overgrown trust fund baby, treating her like an item on a menu he could order at will. Then I looked at Roman Blackwell, sexual predator and part-time human waste disposal unit, standing there with his chest puffed out like a pigeon with delusions of grandeur, waiting for me to either back down or step up. His smile had that practice quality that comes from years of getting away with whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it, because Daddy's money had always been there to smooth over any unpleasant consequences. You have 5 seconds, I told him, and I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Not angry calm or fake calm, but the kind of genuinely peaceful tone you hear from people who've already made their decision and are just waiting for everyone else to catch up. 5 seconds to regret your life choices. Roman's smile got wider, because apparently he mistook my composure for weakness. Classic mistake, really. The guy had probably never encountered someone who didn't immediately fold when faced with his combination of money and manufactured intimidation. He was used to people backing down, apologizing, maybe even thanking him for the privilege of being degraded by someone so important. Or what? He asked, spreading his arms like he was inviting the whole room to witness his inevitable victory. You'll bore me to death with middle-class morality? Jasper did his little snort laugh again, because apparently his job description included provide soundtrack for boss's public humiliation. The crowd pressed closer, phones held high like they were filming a concert instead of what was about to become a very expensive lesson in cause and effect. 10 minutes later, Roman Blackwell was going to learn that money can't buy you everything. Specifically, it can't buy you the ability to walk upright after you've made the catastrophic mistake of putting your hands on someone else's wife while her husband is standing right there, watching, calculating, and running through a mental checklist of every self-defense technique he'd learned in 20 years of staying in shape. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, we were still in that frozen moment before the storm, when everyone in the room was holding their breath and Roman Blackwell still thought he was going to walk away from this with his dignity intact. Poor bastard had no idea what was coming. You know what they don't teach you in those corporate sensitivity training seminars? How to properly dismantle a sexual predator in front of a live audience while maintaining your composure and not spilling your martini. It's really more of a learn-on-the-job situation, and Roman Blackwell was about to become my very first case study in applied workplace conflict resolution. Roman lunged first, which honestly saved me the trouble of having to throw the opening punch. Poor form, really. The guy moved like someone whose only fighting experience came from watching UFC highlights on YouTube while sitting on his Italian leather sofa. He telegraphed that swing like Western Union, all wild haymaker and zero technique. The kind of move that screams, "I've never been in a real fight, but I saw this awesome move in a movie once." I blocked it without even thinking, muscle memory from 20 years of staying in decent shape and 3 years of weekend martial arts classes that I'd taken mostly to avoid Saturday morning honeydew lists. His fist connected with my forearm instead of my face, which seemed to genuinely surprise him, like physics had somehow betrayed his expectations of how this was supposed to go. "Huh," I said, stepping to the side as he stumbled past me. "That's not how they do it in the movies, is it?" The crowd made that collective ooh sound that audiences make when they realize the show's about to get a lot more interesting than they'd bargained for. Phones were recording from every angle, because apparently we'd accidentally stumbled into the world's most improvised episode of When Rich Assholes Attack, and everyone wanted to be the first to upload it to whatever social media platform was trending that week. Roman regained his balance and turned to face me, his expensive suit already looking a little worse for wear. There was something almost comical about watching a man who probably spent more on grooming than I made in a month suddenly realize that his money couldn't actually buy him fighting skills. It was like watching someone discover that their credit card didn't work at the Laws of Physics store. "You're going to regret this," he snarled, which is pretty much what every villain says right before they get their ass handed to them by the protagonist. Classic mistake. Never announce your intentions when you should be throwing punches. It's like giving your opponent a detailed PowerPoint presentation on how you plan to lose. He came at me again, this time with slightly better form, but the same fundamental problem. He was trying to win a fight using anger and entitlement instead of actual skill. I moved methodically, because there's a big difference between losing your temper and fixing a problem. Losing your temper gets messy and unpredictable. Fixing a problem requires precision. I caught his next swing and used his momentum to redirect him into the nearest table, which happened to be the one holding the shrimp platter I joked about earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me. Roman Blackwell, millionaire sexual predator, face first in cocktail sauce and disappointment. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor that would make professional comedians weep with envy. Rib shot, I announced to no one in particular as I landed a quick jab to his side, right where the body tells you it keeps all the important breathing-related equipment. That's going to hurt for a while. Roman made a sound like a deflating balloon mixed with someone stepping on a cat, which I took as confirmation that my technique was working exactly as intended. He doubled over, gasping, probably wondering why his personal trainer hadn't covered what to do when you sexually assault someone's wife and they decide to educate you about consequences. The crowd was getting louder now, that weird mix of excitement and horror that people get when they're witnessing something they know they shouldn't be enjoying, but absolutely are. Someone in the back was actually cheering, which seemed inappropriate, but honestly, I appreciated the support. Shoulder next. I continued my running commentary, because apparently I'd decided to turn this into an instructional video. I grabbed his arm and applied pressure to a spot that would make his right side go temporarily numb. That's a nerve cluster. Very educational. Roman tried to throw another punch with his left hand, but his heart wasn't really in it anymore. The fight had gone out of him faster than air from a punctured tire, and he was starting to look less like a predatory millionaire and more like a confused rich kid who'd wandered into the wrong neighborhood and couldn't figure out why his usual tactics weren't working. I worked through the rest of him methodically, wrist control to stop him from grabbing anything dangerous, a leg sweep that sent him to the floor with all the grace of a falling piano, and a few pressure point applications that would leave him thinking very seriously about his life choices for the next several days. The thing about bullies, I explained to the crowd as Roman writhed on the beige carpet like a very expensive worm, is that they're only dangerous when they think they can get away with it. Take away that safety net, and they're just sad middle-aged men with too much money and not enough parental supervision. 10 minutes. That's all it took to turn Roman Blackwell from predator to punchline. 10 minutes of what I like to think of as remedial education in basic human decency, delivered through the ancient and time-honored method of applied physical consequences. He couldn't stand without help, couldn't string together a coherent sentence, and definitely couldn't maintain that smug expression that had probably gotten him through most of his adult life. The crowd kept filming with one hand while covering their mouths with the other, like they were watching a car accident in slow motion and couldn't decide whether to look away or ask for popcorn. Some people were definitely going to have nightmares about this, but I figured they'd get over it faster than Roman would get over his sudden introduction to the concept of accountability. Jasper, Roman's loyal assistant and professional ego fluffer, had vanished into the crowd somewhere around the third or fourth time his boss hit the floor. Probably updating his LinkedIn profile and practicing his "I never really knew the guy that well" speech for the inevitable HR investigation. Roman lay there making small, whimpering sounds, staring up at the beige ceiling like he was trying to figure out how his evening had gone so spectacularly wrong. His perfect hair was mussed, his expensive suit was torn, and his face had taken on the expression of someone asking the universe, "Why me?" Which seemed like a fair question, honestly. The answer, of course, was simple, because actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences show up wearing a slightly rumpled suit and a very bad attitude. You know what's hilarious about emergency services? They have absolutely perfect timing when it comes to showing up right after all the interesting stuff is over. It's like they've got some kind of supernatural ability to arrive precisely when the drama has shifted from action movie to tedious paperwork and awkward explanations. The sirens started wailing about 30 seconds after Roman Blackwell had finished his impromptu lesson in cause and effect, which meant I had just enough time to straighten my tie and wonder if my health insurance covered legal defense fees. The paramedics rolled in first, because apparently someone in the crowd had called 911 when they realized that Roman's groaning wasn't part of some elaborate performance art piece. They took one look at him sprawled on the beige carpet like a very expensive crime scene outline, and immediately started asking questions that I was pretty sure I didn't want to answer without a lawyer present. "What happened here?" asked the lead paramedic, a woman who looked like she'd seen enough Friday night disasters to write a book about human stupidity and probably had. "Gravity," I replied, which was technically accurate, but probably not the kind of detailed explanation she was looking for. Also, poor decision-making and inadequate conflict resolution skills. Roman tried to say something that sounded like "he attacked me," but it came out more like "he tacked me," because apparently having your ego thoroughly rearranged affects your ability to form coherent syllables. The paramedics ignored his mumbled protests and went about the business of checking to make sure I hadn't accidentally turned him into a very wealthy vegetable. The police arrived next, and let me tell you something about cops at corporate parties. They always look like they'd rather be literally anywhere else on Earth. These two looked like they'd drawn the short straw at the station and were already mentally composing their reports in the most boring language possible so they could get back to real crime instead of whatever rich people nonsense had interrupted their evening. Detective Lang introduced himself like he was ordering coffee at a drive-thru. Professional, but clearly hoping this would all be resolved quickly so he could get back to his car and his probably cold dinner. He had that look that experienced cops get when they realize they're about to spend the next 3 hours dealing with paperwork instead of actual police work. "So," Detective Lang said, pulling out his notebook with the enthusiasm of someone about to file their taxes, "anyone want to tell me what turned this corporate mixer into what looks like a MMA highlight reel?" The crowd had transformed from bloodthirsty spectators into helpful citizens faster than you could say potential witnesses, and suddenly everyone had an opinion about what they'd seen. It was like watching a real-time game of telephone, except instead of whispering secrets, people were describing the same event in increasingly creative ways. "He just attacked that poor man for no reason," shouted someone from the back who clearly hadn't witnessed the part where Roman decided my wife was community property. "That's not what happened at all," countered Maya, the hostess, who had apparently been paying closer attention than most people. Maya stepped forward with the kind of steady composure that made me think she'd probably witnessed her share of corporate disasters and had learned to keep track of the important details. "The man in the expensive suit," she said, pointing at Roman, who was currently being examined for signs of traumatic brain injury, "sexually assaulted this woman. Put his hands under her dress without permission and told her husband to leave because she belonged to him now. Then he challenged the husband to a fight. The husband accepted." Detective Lang wrote this down like he was taking grocery list notes, probably because he'd heard variations of this story about 1,000 times before. Rich guy acts like an asshole, gets his comeuppance, tries to play victim when consequences show up, wearing brass knuckles and a bad attitude. "Anyone else see it this way?" Lang asked the crowd, and suddenly half the room was nodding and the other half was studying their shoes like they'd discovered a fascinating new species of lint. The phone recordings were getting passed around like party favors, because nothing says modern justice system like having your assault case documented by 17 different angles of shaky iPhone footage. Jasper, Roman's loyal assistant and professional sycophant, had reappeared from wherever he'd been hiding and was now trying to do damage control like his job depended on it. Which it probably did, considering his boss was currently face down on a hotel carpet wondering why his money hadn't protected him from the laws of physics. "This is all a misunderstanding," Jasper insisted, doing that nervous hand-wringing thing that people do when they realize they're about to be associated with a very public scandal. "Mr. Blackwell is a respected businessman. He would never put his hands inside a woman's pants without permission." I interrupted, because about 50 people just watched him do exactly that. Also, it's on video. Multiple videos, actually. High definition. Great lighting. Very incriminating. The crowd murmured agreement, because apparently nothing builds consensus like watching a millionaire get his ass kicked for being a predator. Detective Lang looked like he was starting to piece together a story that would write itself. The kind of case that ends with someone very wealthy learning that money doesn't actually buy immunity from assault charges. "We're going to need to see those videos," Lang said to the crowd, and suddenly everyone was volunteering their phones like they were contributing to a digital evidence potluck. "And we're going to need statements from everyone who saw what happened." The internet, meanwhile, had apparently smelled blood in the water and was already trending something called #MineNowDown, which was simultaneously the most ridiculous hashtag I'd ever seen and probably the most accurate summary of the evening's events. Roman Blackwell's name was being shared faster than celebrity gossip, except instead of who wore it better, people were discussing who got what they deserved and how to properly handle sexual predators at corporate events. My lawyer, Sophia, called while the paramedics were loading Roman onto a stretcher. Sophia had that tone that lawyers get when they realize their client has either done something brilliantly justified or catastrophically stupid, and they're not sure which category this particular situation falls into. "Please tell me you didn't just beat up a millionaire at a company party," she said. "I provided educational services to a sexual predator," I corrected. "Very thorough educational services, with visual aids and hands-on learning opportunities." "Jesus Christ," Sophia muttered, which I took as her professional legal opinion on my evening's activities. "Don't say anything else to anyone until I get there. And whatever you do, don't talk to the press." Roman's team wanted a quiet settlement, she told me later. They were offering serious money to make this whole thing disappear, probably because having your boss publicly humiliated for sexual assault is bad for the corporate image. I said no, because some things are more important than money, and watching entitled predators face consequences for their actions is definitely one of them. We wanted truth. We wanted justice. Or at the very least, we wanted Roman Blackwell to learn that the world doesn't actually revolve around his personal desires and credit card balance. You know what's fascinating about courtrooms? They're like theater, except the actors are all terrible. The script was written by someone with a law degree and a caffeine addiction, and the audience is a jury of 12 people who'd rather be literally anywhere else doing anything else. But hey, at least the drama is real, which is more than you can say for most reality TV shows. Roman Blackwell's legal team arrived looking like they'd been assembled from a catalog titled "Lawyers Who Charge More Per Hour Than Most People Make Per Month." Three-piece suits that probably cost more than my car, briefcases that looked like they could survive a nuclear holocaust, and the kind of practiced confidence that comes from years of making problems disappear for people who can afford to make problems disappear. The lead attorney, a woman who introduced herself as Victoria Sterling with the kind of handshake that could crack walnuts, had apparently built her career on defending rich men who'd confused their bank account balance with a permission slip for bad behavior. She had silver hair pulled back in a bun so tight it could have been used as a weapon, and the kind of smile that made you want to count your fingers after shaking hands. "Your Honor," she began, and I could already tell this was going to be one of those performances where someone tries to convince a room full of adults that up is actually down and black is really white if you squint hard enough and ignore basic reality. "My client, Mr. Blackwell, is a respected member of this community, a philanthropist, a job creator, a man who has dedicated his life to making this city a better place." I looked over at Roman, who was sitting at the defendant's table wearing a neck brace that I was pretty sure was more theatrical than medical. The man had recovered from our little educational session remarkably quickly, but apparently his legal team had decided that looking like a victim would play better with the jury than looking like a sexual predator who'd gotten exactly what he deserved. "Mr. Blackwell," Victoria continued, "is guilty of nothing more than a simple misunderstanding. A momentary lapse in judgment brought on by the stress of a demanding career and the pressures of maintaining his numerous charitable obligations. A misunderstanding, right? Because apparently when rich people sexually assault someone, it's a misunderstanding, but when regular folks do it, it's called going to prison. The justice system's got this weird sliding scale where your net worth determines whether your crimes are felonies or just unfortunate miscommunications." Furthermore, Victoria added, really warming up to her theme now, "My client was the victim of an unprovoked and savage attack by Mr. Peterson, who clearly has anger management issues and a propensity for violence." Sophia, my lawyer, made it sound like someone trying not to laugh at a funeral. Sophia looked like she could bench press Victoria Sterling and still have energy left over to cross-examine the entire Supreme Court. She'd built her reputation defending people who couldn't afford three-piece suit attorneys, which meant she'd gotten very good at dismantling the kind of legal bullshit that money usually bought. "Your Honor," Sophia said when it was her turn, "the defense would like the jury to ignore the evidence of their own eyes and ears. They'd like you to believe that sexual assault is a misunderstanding and that defending your wife from a predator is somehow a crime." The prosecution had done their homework, which was refreshing in an age when homework seemed to be optional for most people in positions of authority. They'd gathered the video evidence from about 15 different phones, interviewed the witnesses who'd actually been paying attention instead of just trying to get good footage for their social media, and compiled a case that was more airtight than a pickle jar opened by someone with arthritis. The jury watched the footage like they were binge-watching a particularly disturbing Netflix series. You could see their faces change as they processed what they were seeing. Roman's hand disappearing under Ava's dress, his casual announcement of ownership, the challenge, and then my very thorough response to his educational needs. The video didn't lie, which was probably why Roman's team had spent so much time trying to get it excluded from evidence. Hard to claim misunderstanding when there's high-definition footage of you committing sexual assault while announcing your intention to steal someone's wife like she's a piece of real estate you decided to acquire. Roman tried to be charming during his testimony, which was like watching a snake try to convince you it was actually a friendly puppy. He talked about stress and misunderstandings and how he'd never meant any harm, all while avoiding eye contact with anyone who might call him out on his obvious bullshit. "I may have inadvertently invaded Mrs. Peterson's personal space," he said, which was apparently rich person speak for, "I sexually assaulted her, but I'm going to describe it like I accidentally bumped into her at Starbucks." The witnesses started coming forward during the trial, which was when things got really interesting. Turns out, Roman Blackwell's momentary lapse in judgment was actually more like a decades-long pattern of treating women like they were items on a menu he could order whenever he felt hungry. Former assistants testified about inadvertent personal space invasions and misunderstood professional interactions. HR files that had been buried deeper than nuclear waste suddenly surfaced, full of complaints that had been mysteriously resolved with NDAs and severance packages that bought silence instead of justice. One former employee, a woman named Sarah who'd worked in his corporate office, described how Roman had cornered her in the supply closet and explained that her job security depended on her willingness to provide additional administrative services. When she'd refused, she'd been laid off 2 weeks later for budget restructuring. The pattern was clearer than a freshly cleaned window. Roman Blackwell hadn't committed a crime. He'd been committing crimes, plural, for years. The only difference was that this time, someone had fought back instead of just filing a report that would disappear into the corporate equivalent of a black hole. People who'd once whispered in Roman's ear about business deals and investment opportunities were now coughing loudly in the courtroom whenever his lawyers tried to paint him as a misunderstood philanthropist. Funny how moral clarity improves when there are cameras present and your association with a sexual predator might end up on the evening news. The jury took 3 hours to deliberate, which seemed generous considering the video evidence was basically an instructional film titled How to Commit Sexual Assault and Then Get Your Ass Kicked by Someone Who Doesn't Think You're Above the Law. 3 hours to tell a man that his ego wasn't evidence, his money wasn't a defense, and his sense of entitlement wasn't actually a legal right to other people's bodies. You know that moment in movies when the jury foreman stands up and the entire courtroom holds its breath like they're all underwater? Yeah, well, real life is exactly like that, except it's somehow both more dramatic and more boring at the same time. More dramatic because actual consequences are about to rain down on someone's head. More boring because the foreman was a middle-aged accountant named Gerald who looked like he'd rather be doing literally anything else with his Tuesday afternoon. Has the jury reached a verdict? Asked Judge Morrison, a woman who'd probably seen enough of humanity's worst impulses to write a very depressing memoir about the decline of civilization. She had that look that judges get after 20 years of listening to people explain why their terrible decisions were actually someone else's fault. "We have, Your Honor," Gerald replied, unfolding a piece of paper like he was reading the results of a particularly tense fantasy football league. The courtroom was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop, if pins made sounds when they dropped, which they probably don't, but you get the idea. Guilty. The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had just burned down everything Roman Blackwell thought he knew about how the world worked. 1 syllable. 6 letters. The kind of simple, declarative statement that changes everything and nothing all at once. Guilty of sexual harassment. Guilty of assault. Guilty of thinking that money was a get-out-of-consequences-free card that came with his platinum credit card and sense of entitlement. Guilty of being the kind of man who confused wealth with worth and power with permission. Roman's face went through about 17 different expressions in the span of 5 seconds, like someone was flipping through channels on a TV that only broadcast human emotions. Shock, denial, anger, more denial, a brief stop at bargaining, and then finally settling on the kind of pale, hollow-eyed look that people get when they realize that gravity applies to them after all. His lawyers immediately started muttering about appeals, because apparently the legal system is like a video game where you get multiple lives and can keep playing until you finally beat the level. Victoria Sterling looked like someone had just told her that her expensive law degree was actually a participation trophy, and her client was going to prison regardless of how much he paid her per hour. "We'll be filing an appeal immediately," she announced to the courtroom, like she was making a public service announcement about an upcoming sale at Nordstrom. This verdict is clearly the result of bias against successful businessmen and represents a fundamental miscarriage of justice. Sophia, my lawyer, made that sound again, the one that suggested she was trying very hard not to point out that Victoria Sterling was essentially arguing that rich men should be allowed to sexually assault people without consequences. It's always fascinating to watch expensive attorneys try to convince a room full of adults that their clients' wealth somehow exempts them from the basic human decency requirements that apply to everyone else. The charges against me were dismissed faster than a bad first date, which was refreshing considering I'd spent the last few months wondering if defending my wife from a sexual predator was somehow going to land me in legal trouble. Self-defense, the judge ruled. Plain and simple. Apparently, stopping someone from sexually assaulting your spouse is still considered acceptable behavior, even in our increasingly weird legal system. Some people called me violent after the verdict was announced, which was hilarious considering what they were calling Roman. I got labeled as having anger management issues by people who thought sexual assault was just an aggressive networking strategy. I called it necessary, Because sometimes the world needs people who are willing to step up when entitled predators decide that other humans are their personal property. The media had a field day, naturally. Roman Blackwell's name went from being associated with luxury real estate and charitable donations to being permanently linked with hashtags like #MineNowDown and #EntitledPredator. The same magazines that used to feature him in their most eligible bachelor lists were now running articles with headlines like "From Millionaire to Felon," the Roman Blackwell story, and "How Money Can't Buy You Out of Everything." Women who had been quiet for years suddenly found their voices, and boy, did they have stories to tell. The guilty verdict was like opening a floodgate that had been holding back decades of whispered complaints and buried reports. Former employees, business associates, even women who just had the misfortune of being in the same social circles as Roman started coming forward with their own experiences of his particular brand of entitled harassment. It turned out that Roman's momentary lapse in judgment was actually more like a lifelong pattern of treating women like they were amenities included with his wealth and status. The stories were depressingly similar: casual groping, inappropriate comments, the assumption that any woman in his vicinity was automatically available for his entertainment. One woman described how he'd cornered her at a charity gala and explained that her husband's business loan approval might depend on her willingness to provide additional services. Another talked about how he'd shown up at her apartment uninvited and refused to leave until she'd agreed to have dinner with him. The pattern was clear. Roman Blackwell had spent years using his money and influence to prey on women who couldn't fight back. But this time, he'd picked the wrong target. This time, he'd put his hands on someone whose husband wasn't impressed by bank account balances or intimidated by threats of lawsuits. This time, he discovered that some people still believe in old-fashioned concepts like consequences and accountability. The justice system had edged forward with its characteristic slow, imperfect rhythm, but it had moved. It wasn't perfect, nothing involving humans ever is, but it was progress. Roman Blackwell was going to prison, and more importantly, his victims were finally being heard instead of silenced with NDAs and hush money. My hands still bore the shape of what I'd had to do that night, and I wasn't sorry. Not for a single second. Some people called it violence, but I called it a necessary correction to a system that had been allowing predators to operate with impunity for far too long. The guilty verdict wasn't just about Roman Blackwell. It was about every woman who'd been told to stay quiet, every victim who'd been paid to disappear, every person who'd been made to feel like their dignity was less important than someone else's reputation. You know what's funny about watching someone's entire life implode? It's not actually funny at all, even when that someone is a sexual predator who spent years thinking he was untouchable. Roman Blackwell's downfall wasn't some poetic justice served with a side of dramatic irony. It was more like watching a very expensive house of cards collapse in real time. Except the cards were made of money and arrogance, and gravity had finally decided to show up for work. The fall wasn't cinematic, which was probably disappointing for everyone who'd been expecting some kind of Hollywood-style montage with melancholy music and artistic shots of rain on windows. Instead, it was spreadsheet-level brutal, the kind of systematic destruction that happens when lawyers and accountants get involved and start adding up exactly how much money someone owes in damages, legal fees, and basic human decency. Roman's business empire started crumbling faster than a cookie left out in the rain. Contracts that had seemed ironclad suddenly developed mysterious cancellation clauses that nobody had noticed before. Investment partners who'd been kissing his ass for years suddenly remembered they had other priorities and urgent business elsewhere. It's amazing how quickly people can find the exit when someone's reputation goes from powerful businessman to convicted sexual predator. The magazines that had once featured him in glossy spreads about most influential men under 50 were now running retrospectives with headlines like "How We All Missed the Warning Signs" and "The Roman Blackwell Story," a study in unchecked privilege. Same photos, completely different context. Amazing how a criminal conviction can change the way people interpret your confident smile and commanding presence. His offshore accounts. Because of course he had offshore accounts. Because rich predators always have offshore accounts. Froze up tighter than a jar of pickles opened by someone with arthritis. The government had apparently decided that Roman's financial arrangements needed closer examination, which is bureaucrat speak for, "We're going to turn your entire monetary existence inside out and see what falls out. The lawsuits multiplied like rabbits in springtime, except instead of cute, fluffy animals, they were legal documents demanding massive financial compensation for years of harassment, assault, and the kind of workplace behavior that would make medieval peasants question your moral character. Every woman who'd come forward with a story was now coming forward with a lawyer, and those lawyers were apparently very good at calculating exactly how much Roman's entitled behavior was going to cost him. Real estate was the first domino to fall, which made sense considering that's where most of his legitimate wealth was supposedly stored. The apartment with the skyline view that he'd bragged about in those magazine interviews? Gone, sold to pay legal fees. The vacation house in the Hamptons where he'd hosted those networking events that were apparently just elaborate hunting expeditions for new victims? Also gone, along with any remaining illusions about his character. His car collection went next. Those expensive toys that he'd used to compensate for having the personality of a particularly aggressive parking ticket. The Porsche, the BMW, the vintage Jaguar that he'd claimed was an investment in automotive history, but was really just another way to display his wealth like a peacock showing off its feathers. All auctioned off to the highest bidder, probably to people who wouldn't use them as mobile harassment platforms. The suits went too, which seemed almost symbolic. Those $1,000 outfits that had been his uniform for intimidating people and projecting power were now hanging in some consignment shop, waiting for someone else to buy the costume without the toxic personality that came with it. I wondered if the new owners would know they were wearing the former uniform of a convicted predator, or if they'd just think they were getting a good deal on designer menswear. People who had once bowed and scraped in Roman's presence now couldn't seem to remember his name when reporters asked them about their association with him. Business partners developed sudden amnesia about their previous relationships. Social contacts discovered urgent reasons to be out of town whenever his name came up in conversation. It's remarkable how quickly someone can become a ghost when their presence becomes a liability instead of an asset. The charity boards that had once been honored to have his name associated with their causes started holding emergency meetings about damage control and reputation management. Turns out, having a convicted sexual predator on your board of directors is bad for fundraising efforts, especially when your organization is supposed to be helping vulnerable populations. Who would have thought? His personal staff scattered like roaches when the lights come on. The assistant who'd been filtering his calls and managing his schedule for 5 years suddenly found a new job opportunity that required immediate relocation to another state. The housekeeper who'd been cleaning up his messes, literal and metaphorical, developed a sudden interest in early retirement. Even his personal trainer decided that helping a sexual predator maintain his physical fitness was somehow beneath his professional standards. The social invitations stopped arriving, which was probably the cruelest cut of all for someone whose entire identity had been built around being wanted and included in exclusive circles. The same people who'd been competing for his attention at cocktail parties now avoided eye contact when they passed him on the street. The restaurants where he'd been a VIP regular suddenly had perpetual waiting lists that never seemed to include his name. Roman was forced to move from his penthouse to a regular apartment, then from the regular apartment to something that could charitably be described as modest, and finally to what appeared to be a studio that would have made a college student complain about the lack of space. The man who'd once owned half a city block was now living in accommodations that wouldn't have impressed a mid-level accountant. For us, the noise gradually faded into something resembling normal life, which was honestly more satisfying than any amount of public humiliation could have been. Ava was sleeping through the night again, without the sudden starts and anxious checking of locks that had become routine after the assault. Her emails were no longer coded with the kind of dread that comes from wondering if today would be the day some powerful man decided she was his property. The predator had become the punchline, and somehow that felt like the most appropriate ending of all. Not tragic, not dramatic, just pathetic. A cautionary tale about what happens when you confuse money with immunity and power with permission. We rebuilt our evenings around quiet dinners and genuine laughter instead of nervous glances and whispered conversations about legal strategy. It wasn't poetry, but it was justice, served at room temperature with a side of ordinary human dignity. You know what nobody tells you about being accidentally famous for punching a sexual predator? Life doesn't immediately transform into some kind of inspirational movie montage with uplifting music and meaningful shots of sunrises. Instead, it shifts in these weird, subtle ways that you don't notice until you're standing in the cereal aisle at Target and some stranger wants to shake your hand while you're trying to decide between Cheerios and Frosted Flakes. The changes started small, which was probably for the best, because dramatic life alterations are exhausting, and I was still processing the fact that I'd become the poster child for what happens when you defend your wife from entitled millionaires. Ava was sleeping through the night again, which sounds like such a minor thing until you realize that for months she'd been waking up every few hours, checking the locks, jumping at sounds that turned out to be the refrigerator making ice or the house settling. Her emails used to arrive with this undercurrent of dread, like she was constantly bracing herself for the next shoe to drop, the next powerful man who might decide she was his personal property. Now she was forwarding me funny memes and complaining about normal work stuff like budget meetings and incompetent coworkers who couldn't figure out how to use the copy machine. Normal problems. Beautiful, ordinary, non-criminal problems. The grocery store encounters started about 2 weeks after the trial ended, which was when I learned that being locally famous for dispensing justice is way more awkward than being famous for anything actually cool. I was in the produce section, trying to pick out avocados that weren't either rock hard or mysteriously liquefied, when this woman approached me with the kind of determined smile that usually precedes either a sales pitch or a very uncomfortable conversation. "Excuse me," she said, "aren't you the guy who, with Roman Blackwell?" "I'm the guy who had a disagreement with Roman Blackwell's hands," I replied, because I'd learned that being precise about these things was important. "And won. Good on you," she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she'd maybe had her own encounters with men who thought consent was optional. "My daughter works downtown, and she said all the girls in her office were cheering when they heard what happened." These conversations happened everywhere. The bank, the gas station, the line at the DMV where everyone's already miserable and looking for something to feel good about. People would recognize me from the news coverage or the social media videos, and they'd want to express their approval in that awkward way that strangers do when they're trying to thank you for something they wish they'd been brave enough to do themselves. "You did what we all wanted to do," said the guy behind me in line at the post office, like I'd performed some kind of public service instead of just reacting to someone sexually assaulting my wife. "Rich guys like that think they can do whatever they want." "Yeah, well," I'd reply, because what else do you say to that? Turns out they can't. The weird part was how normal everything else felt. We still had to buy groceries and pay bills and deal with the fact that our dishwasher made that grinding noise that meant it was probably going to die soon. We still argued about whose turn it was to take out the trash and whether we needed to replace the bathroom faucet that had been dripping for 6 months. Life is stubbornly ordinary, even after you've accidentally become a local folk hero. Work was interesting for a while, because suddenly everyone wanted to be my friend in that transparent way that happens when people think you might be useful for something. Coworkers who'd barely acknowledged my existence for 5 years were suddenly inviting me to lunch and asking my opinion on things I had no expertise in, like I'd somehow gained wisdom along with notoriety. "Hey," said Jerry from accounting, sliding up to my desk like we'd been best buddies since kindergarten. "My wife's been having trouble with her boss. Guy's been making inappropriate comments. You think maybe you could have a conversation with him?" "I think your wife should file a complaint with HR," I told him, because apparently some people thought I'd appointed myself as some kind of freelance justice dispenser. "And if that doesn't work, she should call a lawyer. I'm not the sexual harassment police." But people kept asking, like I'd discovered some magical formula for dealing with entitled assholes that could be applied to any situation. The truth was, there was no formula. Roman Blackwell had made a specific choice to put his hands on my wife in front of 50 witnesses, and I'd made a specific choice to respond with educational violence. It wasn't a business model or a life philosophy. It was just what happened when someone crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. The media attention faded eventually, the way it always does when something newer and shinier comes along to distract everyone from whatever they were paying attention to last week. Roman Blackwell went from being front-page news to being buried in the back sections, then to being mentioned only in passing, then to being forgotten entirely except by the people whose lives he'd damaged. Ava's laugh came back gradually, the real one instead of the careful, professional version she'd been using for months. I'd catch her humming while she made coffee in the morning, or singing along to the radio in the car, and I'd realize that we were building something new on top of the wreckage of whatever we'd been before. You know what's weird? She said one evening while we were doing the dishes, which had become our unofficial processing the day ritual. I feel guilty about feeling good about what happened to him. You mean about Roman losing everything? Yeah. Like, I know he deserved it, but watching someone's entire life collapse is still kind of horrifying, even when they're a terrible person. That's because you're a decent human being, I told her, which was true. Decent people don't enjoy watching other people suffer, even when those people have earned it. That's what makes you different from him. We rebuilt our evenings around things that had nothing to do with legal strategies or media coverage or the ongoing saga of Roman Blackwell's spectacular downfall. We watched terrible movies and ordered too much takeout and had conversations about normal stuff like whether we should repaint the bedroom and what to do about the tree in the backyard that was growing too close to the power lines. People expected me to be proud, which was understandable but not quite accurate. Pride felt like the wrong emotion for the situation, like celebrating a necessary medical procedure or feeling good about putting out a fire. I was relieved. Relieved that it was over. Relieved that justice had actually functioned the way it was supposed to. Relieved that my wife could sleep through the night again without checking the locks. So here we are, sitting in my living room 6 months later, and I'm looking at Roman Blackwell's latest mugshot in the local paper. Apparently, he violated his parole by showing up drunk at his former assistant's apartment building and demanding she let him explain how sorry he was. The man can walk again, eventually. He can talk in short sentences when he concentrates really hard. But the most important thing he lost wasn't his mobility or his money or even his precious reputation. It was his illusion of immunity. You want to know what Roman Blackwell really lost? The belief that consequences were for other people. The assumption that his bank account was a get-out-of-jail-free card that came with unlimited uses. The comfortable delusion that being rich meant being untouchable, that having money somehow exempted him from the basic social contract that says you can't put your hands on other people without permission. He's paid in ways his offshore accounts never covered. His name went from being synonymous with success and influence to being a cautionary tale that parents tell their sons about what happens when you confuse wealth with worth. His reputation, which he'd spent decades carefully crafting, became a punchline that nobody wanted to be associated with. The powerful connections that had once opened doors now slammed them shut faster than a bank vault during a robbery. But here's what we gained, and you can't put this on any balance sheet or calculate it in quarterly earnings reports. Ava's voice came back. Not just her ability to speak up in meetings or express her opinions at dinner parties, but something deeper than that. The easy confidence that comes from knowing that when someone crosses a line, there will be consequences. The quiet strength that comes from discovering that not everyone will stand by and watch while you're being violated. Her laugh is unguarded now, the real thing instead of that carefully modulated professional version she'd been using for months. She sings in the shower again, which sounds like such a small thing until you realize that people don't sing when they're constantly looking over their shoulder, waiting for the next predator to announce that they've been claimed as property. Is what I did revenge? Some people would say absolutely, because apparently defending your wife from a sexual predator is somehow equivalent to being vindictive. These are usually the same people who think that consequences are a form of persecution and that holding powerful men accountable for their actions is somehow unfair to powerful men. Others would say it was necessary defense, which seems more accurate to me. I didn't hunt Roman Blackwell down in some elaborate scheme for vengeance. I didn't spend months plotting his downfall or planning the perfect moment to strike. The man put his hands on my wife, announced his intention to steal her like she was a piece of real estate he'd decided to acquire, and then challenged me to do something about it. So I did something about it. I say it was accountability with bone-deep consequences, the kind of education that sticks with you longer than any motivational seminar or corporate sensitivity training. Roman Blackwell learned that actions have results, that choices have prices, and that some people still believe in old-fashioned concepts like defending the people you love from predators who think consent is optional. The thing about bullies and predators is that they're only dangerous when they think they can get away with it. Take away that safety net, remove the assumption of immunity, and they're just sad, entitled people who never learned that the world doesn't actually revolve around their personal desires. Roman Blackwell spent years operating under the belief that his money made him untouchable, that his influence meant he could treat other people however he wanted without facing any meaningful consequences. If you think revenge belongs only to the bitter, maybe you've never seen the look on a predator's face when he realizes that someone else has been keeping score. Maybe you've never watched an entitled bully discover that their victims aren't actually as powerless as they assumed. Maybe you've never experienced the particular satisfaction that comes from watching a system actually work the way it's supposed to work, even if it took a little extra encouragement to get there. The legal system moved, slowly and imperfectly, but it moved. Roman Blackwell went to prison, not because he was poor or powerless or politically inconvenient, but because he committed crimes and someone was finally willing to hold him accountable for them. His victims found their voices, not because they suddenly became braver, but because they finally saw evidence that speaking up might actually accomplish something besides getting them fired or sued or intimidated into silence. That's not revenge. That's justice finally showing up for work after taking an extended vacation. That's accountability breaking through years of institutional protection and willful blindness. That's consequences catching up with someone who'd spent decades outrunning them through a combination of wealth, influence, and the collective willingness of decent people to look the other way rather than get involved. So drop your verdict in the comments section, because apparently everything is a democracy now, and we're all judges in the court of public opinion. Was I justified in turning Roman Blackwell's attempt at sexual assault into an impromptu lesson in cause and effect? Or should I have stood there politely while he explained to my wife that she belonged to him now? I read every single comment, by the way. The ones calling me a hero, and the ones calling me a thug, and the ones trying to explain why what I did was somehow worse than what Roman did. I read the messages from women thanking me for doing what their husbands, fathers, and brothers never did. I read the complaints from men who think I made them all look bad by setting an unreasonable standard for how to respond when someone sexually assaults your wife. Hit like if you believe dignity is worth defending, because apparently we live in an age where that's somehow a controversial position. Share this story if you enjoyed watching the mask slip off someone who'd been pretending to be a human being while actually operating as a predator in an expensive suit. But mostly, remember this. Some people think the world is their personal playground where other people exist for their entertainment and gratification. Every once in a while, those people meet someone who disagrees with that assessment and has the backbone to do something about it. That's not revenge. That's just Tuesday night in America, where consequences still exist for people willing to enforce them.